Hello, I'm the Reverend Kirk Thomas, and welcome to the fourth in our Cosmology and Religion series, and this one is The Nature of Sacrifice, through the ideas of pollution and protection. Now, earlier we said that sacrifice was about giving and forming relationship with the spirits and gods in order to get wondrous things. Well, it's not just that. There's also the aspect of protection. Protection against terrible things. Now, there were three main things that people in ancient days really feared, and those were war, disease, and famine. And these three things, singly or together, could totally destroy a society. So these things were important to ward off if they could. Now, I want to demonstrate a little bit about the obligations to prevent or at least stave off terrible, terrible things. And this is from the Iliad, which is the Greek tale about the Greek conquest of Troy, the Trojan War. Now, in this tale, the king Agamemnon took a priest's daughter as spoils of war, against her father's will, of course. And so the priest called upon Apollo to help him. Now, this priest had a really good relationship with Apollo, and Apollo listened to him. And so what Apollo did is he began to shoot arrows of plague into the Greek army. And the plague spread rampantly, killing men right and left. And so Agamemnon was forced to give the girl back to her father. And the deal was that if he did that the priest would pray to Apollo to end this plague. But you know, soothing Apollo's wrath was not going to be easy. I mean, this was going to require something big. And so what they did was they performed what's called a hecatomb, which is a sacrifice of 100 cattle. Now, here we can see the text from there. Apollo did what he asked for, and when they had prayed and sprinkled the goats and oxen with grains of barley, they pulled back their heads and cut their throats, and they skinned them and carved out the thigh bones and wrapped these in layers of fat for the god, with strips of lean meat on top. The old priest burned them over the fire and poured wine upon them, and the young men stood near him, holding the 5-pronged spits. And this appeased the angry god. Usually, though, this was done after the fact. Usually these great sacrifices would take place in anticipation, before something terrible happened. The whole idea, you see, is that disorder has to be avoided. When everything is orderly, things are good. You know, there's enough food to eat, the wars aren't terrible, and life continues. But with disorder comes war and famine and disease. So, now, disorders can be big ones, and they can come from our mistakes, you know, like sacrilege, think of Agamemnon. But they can also come from little bitty errors, like making a mistake in ritual. And that's nothing to the extent of Agamemnon's error. But to correct these mistakes, you know, some form of atonement was required to be made. And first, people had to acknowledge the fact that they had done wrong, and then they had to do something about it. So, in personal relationships between people, usually there has to be an apology. You know, we all require one, and it has to be sincere. And this is best if it's followed by restitution of some kind. You know, making right what you wronged. And if you don't do this, disorder will continue. And that's not necessarily good. Now, this applies to our relationships with the gods as well. If disorder continues, you see, the gods cannot be relied upon to hold up their side of the bargain, to maintain their side of the Gostis relationship. So a sacrifice would be made to help restore this order. sort of like the apology that we've already mentioned. Now, this thing is called a piacular sacrifice. Now, piacular is this word from the Proto-Indo-European and through Latin descendant words, and what it means essentially is expiation or atonement. Now, we'll get to expiation later, but y'all know what atonement means, right? Making that better which you screwed up. Now, the Latin word pietas comes from this, and what that was a pious bargain we have made with the gods, what I've been calling the ghostis relationship. Now, in English, our word piety comes from pietas, and what it really means is the correct relationship that we have with our friends and family, with fellow citizens, and with the gods. Piety is about doing, all right? It does not mean holier than thou. Now, this relationship is mutual, and it's governed by those rules of reciprocity that everybody is involved in. And reciprocity also includes how one might present oneself to the gods and spirits. Let's face it, if someone's absolutely filthy and stinky and nasty and horrible, you're not going to want to shake hands with them, right? So now we're into pollution and purification. So let's look for a moment at the dictionary definitions of to pollute, okay? They are to remain unfit or harmful to living beings, to make foul or filthy, and to contaminate and to defile. Yuck. So, okay, nowadays, most of us bathe pretty regularly, you know. We live in clean conditions. If we get sick, we go see a doctor, if we can. And when vaccinations are on offer, we get them, or at least should do. And during a pandemic, something which is much more rare nowadays than it was in the ancient world, we quarantine, because that's what you have to do. Oh, the ancients did that as well. And also, in most places in the West nowadays, water's pretty clean. Now, Flint, Michigan notwithstanding, the water is generally okay. Certainly you can bathe in it. There's nothing wrong with most of our water supplies in the first world. But as a result of this, of course, we're generally pretty healthy, right? But this was not the case in the ancient world. They did not know about germ theory. So they didn't know about germs, they didn't know about viruses. They really didn't know what caused disease. And they had no idea how diseases spread. I mean, take the word malaria. What that means is bad air. They thought the air was bad, instead of the fact that malaria comes from mosquito bites, which also brings us to like the Black Death. They had no idea how that was passed. During the Middle Ages, you'd see these plague doctors running around with these great big masks that looked like beaks on their faces, because those things were filled with pleasant-smelling herbs, because they thought it was the bad air that caused the diseases. When in actuality, the Black Death was carried by rats and it was transmitted through fleas. They had no idea. They did notice, however, that filth was bad and cleanliness was good. But since they didn't really know better, they thought that some things could be considered unclean just because they were messy. You know, like sex. Sex can be really messy. Menstruation, which can be messy, but I also think a great deal of misogyny went into that. You know, putting women down. I mean, if you're a guy and you're bleeding, it's because you've got a wound. Women bleed every month, right? So guys would look at that and think, oh, how can they do it? It must be some kind of magic, maybe black magic. So we got to keep the women separate when they're menstruating. Which is pretty stupid, really, but they didn't know any better, right? One thing that does cause disease that they sort of figured out was the handling of dead bodies. typhoid. Horrible things can come from dead bodies. So they knew that anyone who had to handle a dead body was, ceremonially at least, unclean. Now, when we think of dead bodies, Ebola, that was rampant in certain parts of Africa a few years ago, is a good example of that. That was literally spread by people washing the bodies of the dead, because it took almost nothing to get contaminated. Any body fluid would contaminate someone. So they were really right about that one. But then, remember, another meaning of pollute means being ceremonially impure or profane. A big one in terms of being polluted and not acceptable was committing murder. Now, all right, but what we're seeing mostly here, with the exception of murder, is cleanliness, okay? In the Iliad, Book 2, lines 269 to 71, Hector, who is the Prince of Troy and the greatest warrior on the Trojan side, says, and we quote, "And I dare not pour a libation to the immortals with unwashed hands, nor may anyone offer prayers to Lord Zeus when he is filthy with blood and gore." So, cleanliness is involved here, but it's also ritual purity, because to go unclean before the gods would be offensive, all right? And what this other thing about being offensive is about is harmony, When we're unhappy, sometimes if we're really unhappy, we withdraw from other people, we withdraw from our altars, and what's going on is that our harmony has been disrupted. And you see, harmony can be disrupted by all kinds of things. Of course, bloodshed will disrupt anybody's harmony. I mean, you look at warriors nowadays, soldiers coming back from war, just like warriors coming back from war in the ancient days. They were changed. They had seen death. They had dealt death. And while the city in the ancient days wouldn't, and even nowadays, will not condemn a warrior or a soldier for killing in the line of duty, it's still going to affect them, So, let's talk a bit about the Greek idea about this stuff. The opposite of sacredness in ancient Greece was defilement. Okay, killing, making someone filthy, whatever, that's defilement. You see, because the Greeks had this concept of miasma, which is any dislocation of normal life, anything which is outside of normal life, such as sex, birth, death, and murder. I mean, you don't do, well, some people are lucky and have sex all the time, but no, we don't have sex every day. You don't give birth every day. People, with any luck, don't die every day. And we don't have murders committed every day. So those are outside of the bounds, okay? And these things, because they cause defilement, had to be avoided before coming before the gods. Now, sometimes these things are unavoidable, like the soldier or warrior going off to war and having to kill and then coming back. That's unavoidable. They have to do that. Other things could be giving birth. You get pregnant, you're going to give birth. It's going to happen with any luck. And you couldn't stop that. And sex, let's face it, you're going to have it. What can we say? So if these things were unavoidable, you could still go before the gods, but you had to have certain cleansings first. These special cleansings are what they call expiations, and I mentioned those earlier. So you would have to do these things. Now, that could be washing. Just simply washing yourself completely would take the defilement off of you, except for murder, that's different. But if you were in a household that where someone had died and you had to deal with the body, but you're still in the house, you were still part of that family, you would also have to expiate, to cleanse yourself of the death before you could go before the gods. Other things that could be done would be just the sprinkling of water. So just washing and cleaning yourself could clear the pollution, the miasma, if you will. So water in some cultures could be seen to clear the soul. And so we see in Rig Veda 1, Book 1, verses 23, 22, and also in Book 10, verses 9.8, it says, "O waters, carry this away, whatever trouble is in me, whether I have committed deceit or I have cursed, as well as untruth." Then again, there's also fire or smoke that could be used to cleanse. I mean, we often in the modern world use incense. Some people still use sage, although so many are allergic to it, and there's issues with sage. But whatever it is you use, that is a form of cleansing. And in the ancient world, there is something in Ireland that was mentioned in Cormac's glossary. Mayday, that is Biltane, that is lucky fire, that is two fires which the Druids used to make with great incantations, and they used to bring the cattle as a safeguard against diseases of each year to those fires. And in the margins, someone had written in, they used to drive the cattle between them. So that was a form of cleansing. You can easily imagine if the animals have been cooped up all winter long because they couldn't be released to the upper pastures where maybe was snow, and down below it was probably pretty muddy in Ireland, so they keep them sort of cooped up and feed them the hay and things that they had gathered over the previous summer and autumn. But putting them close together like that could mean they were really quite infested with bugs, you know, and it could be, I don't know for sure, but it could be that driving the cattle between two real smoky fires would tend to force the bugs to jump off the cattle and go away so that they could have much healthier cattle to take up into the upper fields. It's a possibility, okay? Now, the whole idea of protection with sacrifice comes to something called an apotropaic offering. Now, what that is, that's an offering to avert bad luck or to avert terrible things. And the word apotropaic comes from the Proto-Indo-European and Greek words meaning to turn away or to turn away bad stuff. So, offerings would be made before the event to prevent war, death, disease, other nasty things. In some cultures, like Roman Greece, offerings were even made to the dead to keep the dead happy, you know, to keep them out of everybody's hair. And these offerings could also be considered apotropaic. Now that brings us to judicial executions. This one's a difficult one. Because they may have been apotropaic because they did, an execution would remove the dangerous power, you know, the criminal, from society. But this is not necessarily an offering made to the gods or to a spirit, you know? I mean, we could argue about this back and forth with the whole human sacrifice thing, and I'll mention that for a moment in a bit, but not yet. I tend not to think of an execution as being a form of sacrifice, okay? But there is something that the ancients did that you may have heard of, and that's scapegoats. Now, the actual scapegoat word comes from something in the Old Testament where they would drive a goat out into the desert to carry their sins away. Well, maybe they influenced ancient Greece, because the Greeks had the pharmakos, which was usually an ugly man who was feasted and pampered and treated like a king and essentially made the center of the city, okay? The idea being that he would soak up all the miasma in the city, and then after the fixed amount of time, it could be as much as a year, they would drive him out out of the city gates and out into the countryside. They drive him away so that he would carry the city's miasma with him. Going back to this possible human sacrifice thing, there is a report that Caesar made about the Gauls during his conquest of Gaul. Now, I'm going to say this. He's not necessarily trustworthy as our Caesar. He often wrote about things that he never witnessed, merely taking other people's word for it. That's not necessarily bad, but you have to remember that Caesar also may have had an axe to grind. He was fighting a very expensive war against the Celts in ancient Gaul, which is modern France, and he needed the support of the Senate. That's why he wrote his book on the Gallic Wars, and that was to drum up support. So making the Gauls sound like horrible, nasty, terrible people, he could justify what he was doing. So let's just keep that in mind. But one of the things he mentioned was the Wicker Man. Now, you may have heard of that. There was a very popular movie made in the 90s with Christopher Lee, I think, playing the lead of the island, and they made a pretty terrible remake in the aughts, I think it was. But the idea of the Wicker Man, as Caesar put it, would be this massive man-shaped object made out of wicker would be created, and in it they would put their sacrificial offerings, fruits and vegetables and sheep and goats. And they also put in, according to Caesar, condemned criminals. So this is also sort of a judicial execution. But Caesar also said that if there didn't have any criminals at the time, they could just take innocent peasants and put them in there instead. Which makes it sound like, if indeed this was done, it makes it sound like more of a sacrifice to the gods, because it was very important. And when they were all in there, they'd do a big ritual, and then they'd burn it, and burn everything in it alive. So, in a way, they may have been scapegoats. Well, there is a modern thing that I do that I quite like, and I've even taken these into the prison I volunteer at, and that is I would make a little, just a little Wicker Man, and then I would have all of the folks around write on a piece of paper something they wanted to get rid of, something they wanted to lose from their personalities, from their lives, from their luck, whatever, to write what it is they really needed. And then to put that piece of paper all folded up and to shove it in the Wicker Man. And then at the high point of the ritual, as part of the prayer of sacrifice, we would burn the Wicker Man. And in that case, he definitely was a scapegoat. He took all our stuff from us. All right, so I've mentioned human sacrifice. I'm not going to go into it because it's a very long and complicated discussion, which maybe I should do a video on. But the thing is that you have some scholars who see human sacrifice everywhere, and you have other scholars who don't see it anywhere. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. We're pretty sure it happened. Livy, the Roman author Livy, mentions a human sacrifice that the Romans did in the BC era when they were being very terribly harassed by the Gauls, where they buried alive 2 Greeks, man and a woman, and 2 Celts, man and a woman. And that's definitely a human sacrifice. But as far as we know, that was the only one. At least that's the only one that was attested. It did happen, but it was probably pretty rare. And it was probably only done when there were in extreme circumstances of some kind. People like to bring up the bog bodies, the bodies that they have found in the bogs that were actually in really good shape, because the bogs would tend to prevent putrefaction. They would prevent the microbes from, eating them up. And there are evidences that they were possibly executed probably executed. The one in particular was not a triple death, unlike what Ann Ross said, but was, probably had his throat slit. He probably had his throat slit. And he had eaten a burned bannock. They found that in his stomach. And he was probably an aristocrat because his hands had no calluses on them. So he might have been a sacrifice, it's possible. But of course, that body was also found to have been buried or killed during the Roman time, and the Romans had banned human sacrifice. So maybe it was a murder. Maybe somebody was getting rid of somebody and throwing them in the bog and weighting them down with stones or something. We don't know. There's no guarantee that that was a sacrifice. Might have been, might not have been. But anyway, so it's a long and complicated issue. And if you want to read more about it in my book, Sacred Gifts, Reciprocity in the Gods, in the chapter on purification and protection, you will see a discussion that I did on human sacrifice. And you can read that if you like. But I really think the important thing to remember is that this kind of sacrifice, this kind of offering thing to the gods, was about cleanliness and harmony. Harmony within yourself and harmony with those around you. And harmony with the gods and spirits. So these things would make for a good, orderly experience for everybody. Thank you.